E já a seguir vai estar aqui alguém que importa muito escutar com atenção, Sir Paul Collier. É tempo para pensarmos o futuro do capitalismo e também, já aqui falamos, se é ou não, e é preciso uma dimensão moral. Conversa entre Sir Paul Collier, Paulo Portas e moderada pelo Pedro Faustino da Accenture. Pedro, vamos a isto.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today again. In case you are wondering why am I speaking in English, it's not just because I want to practice my English with Dr. Paulo Portas, it's because we have an English guest we will call in a few minutes. Over the next 50 minutes, more or less, we will talk about economic development, about capitalism. But before that, let me share with you just a very short story, because every moment has his reason why, and this one is no exception. And a few years ago, I was talking with a good friend of mine about economic development in the world. And you know, the world is a huge place, and the economic history is very, very long. And it's very easy to get a bit lost in translation discussing this. And I guess he found me really lost, because he told me, Pedro, there's a book you absolutely have to read, and I just did it. So moving forward, after reading the book, I went after the author. I had the chance to interview him online last summer. And finally, 2 months ago, I traveled to Oxford and I had a chance to meet him in person. And so here we are today. I take this opportunity to introduce our first guest, Professor Collier. I don't know if you are hearing us. Let's try technology.
I'm hearing you very well.
Good morning.
I'm hearing you very well. I hope you can hear me.
Good morning. Sir Paul Collier.
Good morning.
Good morning. He's an economist, a professor at the University of Oxford, a researcher about topics such as poverty, migrations, and of course economic development. He's also considered today one of the world top global thinkers. Professor Collier, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I'll come back to you in a few minutes. And first let me introduce our second guest. Because we are not talking about local issues, we needed another equally global mind, equally brilliant, someone who already had the tough experience of putting theory into practice under very defined circumstances. Dr. Paulo Portas, introducing you is a very hard task because absolutely everyone in the audience knows you.
Probably. Hi, Professor.
Hi, it's good to meet you.
Professor Collier, let's get back to you. We all want economic development and social progress, and we thought we had discovered this magic formula of capitalism, but it seems that the formula has not worked so well after all. So, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, Professor, what happened?
Well, let me try and tell you. I'm going to start with the fact that in the last 6 months, we've had the perfect storm of shocks that nobody anticipated. There have been shocks to markets. We don't know what's going to happen. Supply shocks, we don't know how long they'll persist. Cost shocks, we don't know how long they'll persist. And post-COVID demand, it's unlikely to go back to anything that looked like pre-COVID demand, but we don't know what it is. So massive shocks to markets, but then huge shocks to expectations from leaders, whether they're business leaders or political leaders. And that shock has come from Zelensky in Ukraine. Zelensky has shown a new model of ethical leadership. Here was a leader who was prepared to die for his beliefs. And that contrast between Zelensky's very ethical leadership and Putin's completely repulsive leadership, combined with the comedy of oligarchs and their super yachts all around Europe, that contrast has raised expectations of the ethical purpose of leaders, both in business and in politics, in a way that could not have been anticipated. Now, so let me go back to the future of capitalism and its thesis. And it started from the sad fact that business has lost the trust of citizens. It's happened around the world, most especially in my own country of Britain, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. Why? Because repeatedly business behaved as though it put profits above purpose, and as though leaders didn't trust their own workforce, but were overconfident in saying, I know best, you do what I want, the Putin style. And the result of that revulsion against business was a polarization between a minority that became very successful and a majority that didn't. And what that produced around the world was populist mutinies. The future of capitalism sells best in Latin America. I've had to give the keynote addresses to every major business conference in Latin America over the last year. And that's because Latin America is an extreme example of people's revulsion against business, the loss of trust in business, and highly polarized societies, resulting most recently in an election in Peru between a crook and an idiot. And each got roughly 50% of the vote. The idiot won. There should never have been a choice between a crook and an idiot. The center ground got crowded out. And we have to rebuild that center ground. Now, the good news is that people work in communities of work and live in communities of place. And so the leaders who run these communities of work and the political leaders who run communities of place have an opportunity to take us up to the best features of human nature or drag us down to the worst features. We're a mammal, but we're a very unusual mammal. Because we're a mammal, we can be dragged down to the worst features of mammals: greedy, selfish, and lazy. Darwinian man. And sometimes we are. Sometimes we live in organizations, whether it's places of work or places of home, we live in organizations where sometimes leadership drags us down. But there are other options. We're a very unusual mammal. We're a massively pro-social, creative mammal, which has learnt how to work in quite big groups, big teams, and to be creative and innovative. We're a very, very unusual mammal, and you don't have to take it from me. Joe Heinrich, the head of evolutionary biology at Harvard, a complete polymath, He's written a couple of wonderful books. I recommend The Secret of Our Success as a Species. Why are we so successful compared with other species? Because we're so unusually pro-social and creative. So human nature is this two facets. In the worst sort of organizations, we can be dragged down to greedy, lazy, and selfish. And in the best organizations, we can be raised up, not to sainthood, that's not on the menu, but we can be raised up to purpose, to believe in purposes that are larger than just ourselves. And good leaders in business can build that sort of organization and do. The big advantage of business, and especially of IT business, over political leaders, is business can move fast. And IT, especially, is used to thinking fresh ideas. And so your huge advantage is speed of reaction. How do you react to the new situation? New markets and new expectations, new ethical expectations of leaders. You've got in the markets, the change is an opportunity. And some firms see big shocks as opportunities, and others are fearful and try and close their eyes to new opportunities. They tremble. I was just yesterday giving a public address in Munich, and it did strike me that Germany is a very fearful society in comparison with Portugal. So a mindset which says these shocks that change our cost structures, that change the way markets will develop in a way that's still uncertain, but that's a huge opportunity. And we need to see them as opportunities. And what do you do when you don't know what's going to happen? You learn rapidly. And that is the great genius of IT at its best. You've got mindsets well suited to learning rapidly. What does learning rapidly look like? Just a couple of principles, and then I'll stop. So one principle of rapid learning is to do devolved experiments. Why do you need to devolve experiments to teams? Well, we're naturally, as humans, evolved to work in teams and to take some responsibility for creative attempts at trying to solve problems. So a good leader, just like Zelensky, says he sets a common purpose around an organization, a firm, and then has the courage to say, I don't really know how to achieve it. That's the purpose. You in your teams go and experiment, and let's learn from each of you trying different things. That is rapid learning, and it comes through devolving agency to teams and setting a common purpose. You set the goal and then you devolve. To be able to do that, you have to build a we. You have to be able to look at your employees and say we. And if you get out of the corporate jet and live in a big fancy house and pay yourself 500 times your average employee's earnings, which is what some fintech in America does, you can't credibly look at your employees and say we. What your employees hear is you. So you've got to be building trust by being the first to sacrifice your own interest for the interest of the whole organization. The don't be Facebook. If you followed what's happened to Facebook, its own employees mutinied, its own very senior employees testified against what Facebook was doing. If you want to follow that, it testified very recently under oath before the British Parliament with devastating evidence that Facebook knew that its algorithms were creating ethnic cleansing all around different communities in Africa. A complete disgrace. Why did Facebook do that? Because it was profitable. And it was so unethical that its own senior employees blew the whistle against it. Don't be Facebook. Facebook is going to face enormous problems. The European Commission is going to regulate Facebook and tax Facebook, if not into oblivion, into a very much weaker situation. So don't follow the path of Facebook. Finally, how do we heal polarized societies? How in Latin America, where there's really vicious divisions, who should go first in making sacrifices? The new shocks that we face means that collectively we're going to be worse off. And so who should make the biggest sacrifices? And the obvious point, as soon as you ask that, is that the richest should move first. That is the lesson for all businesses trying to re-establish the reputation of their business, both with their customers and with their own employees. Purpose before short-term profits, in the end, leads to more secure long-term profitability. Thanks very much, Pedro. I'll pass back.
Thank you so much, Professor Collier. Let's try to understand how can we deal with those challenges. Before I pass on to Dr. Paulo Portas, and just because I forgot to say to our audience, this will be an interactive debate, so I ask you please grab your mobile phones, open the Congress app, because you have a few polls, a few very simple questions to ask you. You can answer those questions, and you can also ask us some questions that, if you have time, we can address to our guests. Dr. Paulo Portas, welcome again. One of the main ideas behind what Professor Collier told us is that capitalism is somehow failing all over the world with a lot of consequences. I saw one of the infographics you showed us on one of your TV programs recently. This one we have behind us. It shows us the global GDP distribution around the world. And looking at it, I would say that, well, capitalism has made a pretty good job after all. So where do we stand? Has it failed or not?
So good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody. And welcome, Professor Collier. He's a distinguished academic. His book is remarkable. If I may recommend everybody to read it, it's very interesting.
We have a few ones to deliver at the end.
Okay. There is a business case here. Okay, but I agree with many of Professor's ideas. In some cases, I have some perplexities. Okay, I would love to share. But just to open the remark, I listened to Professor Collier, and I would add to his comment on what happened 6 months ago, that none of the two phenomena we were and we are still living in, I mean the pandemics and the invasion of Ukraine, were considered possible, even less probable, if you read every relevant forecast about 2020 or 2022. It's a failure for consultants.
No one forecasted it.
No one. The last time the very respected World Economic Forum forecasted pandemics or even epidemics as a global risk was in 2008. Okay? So
they did ask Bill Gates.
No, they didn't ask. So my problem is we are obliged to navigate. I use navigate because of the Portuguese and the British. They know a lot about it. To navigate among unpredictability. Okay? So not impossible, but tough, difficult. The second thing is, remembering the central idea of our debate, I personally think that if Russia was a capitalistic country, Putin would not be the Russian leader today. There is a difference between not the political regimes of China and Russia, but economic framework in Russia and in China. We must admit, I personally, I'm absolutely convinced that Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, when the failure started, according to Professor Collier, Deng Xiaoping, we are convinced that the guys that changed the world are Gorbachev, John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan. Yes, it's 50% of truth. The other guy that changed the world is called Deng Xiaoping. When he changed China, he changed Asia, and we changed Asia, he changed the world. And some years ago, or 2 years ago, I think, one of my students asked me, but do you think China is a communist country today? I hesitated before answering. And the best answer I could give is it's ruled by a communist party, and it's authoritarian politically, but economically, I can't say it is a Marxist regime. We couldn't say the same about Russia. Russia is an authoritarian regime. To be honest, it was almost always a country more used to obey than to choose. But they didn't change the basics of the economic framework. They just made a translation between state ownership and oligarchs' ownership. So you don't have an open society, an open dynamics, an open pressure that would have probably changed the regime. That gives you a sort of more balanced idea about capitalism. And I agree with when Professor Collier says, market has failures, I agree. When Professor Collier says, capitalism is the only economic model that was in capacity during 2 centuries and something more to bring constant progress to humankind, I agree. We shouldn't abolish capitalism, namely because we wouldn't know what to put there in place. And all the recent experiences to put something different or opposite to capitalism were a disaster. Okay? So those who consider capitalism anticipatedly death are probably forgetting what happened to socialism as an economic model.
We have a memory problem.
Yes. So the third thing I agree is, for the moment, till the 80s, capitalism was able to fix its own problems. So you can reform capitalism. Capitalism is more flexible, adaptable, But the current failure is taking time. Even if we live in not normal times, but it's taking time. The other thing I agree with Professor, I agree and I admire, is pragmatism. It stands for pragmatism, and he describes very well what is the genealogy of, the theoretical genealogy of pragmatism, with very respected authors. He stands also for something I think it's very useful for political and entrepreneurial deciders. I mean, try to experiment in a local base, in a restricted area, learn in action, correct, perform better next time. It's I fear, I think it's much more useful, the method of experimentalism to reform than the big announcement of big reforms that will bring you a new world and a new tomorrow morning, okay? Finally, I want to give to share some of my perplexities. One is a wording question. You know, Professor, for continental Europeans, the idea that capitalism or something, not only capitalism, the idea that the capitalism needs morals. Morality is one of the most ancient and controversial concepts in our humankind history. You use sometimes morality or ethics. I would be more comfortable with the idea of an ethical approach on capitalism. And because the problem, if you put the problem at the level of morality, who fixes morality? Who controls morality? And I need to agree or I can disagree. If you put the problem at the level of ethics, ethics is more close to the legal framework, what the law considers the ethical behavior of business owners, business leaders, business mission. And with legality is what the legal framework will say about responsibility of firms is I would say, a more pragmatic concept and a more useful concept. And by the way, Professor is always saying that, namely the British vision of business community responsibilities is not enough, because business leaders are responsible first, second, and third to shareholders. And I think he stands for a more large concept of responsibility, legal concept of responsibility. The second, so this is a wording question. I wouldn't put morals in the debate, but
you'd put
just ethics, because it's closer to legal framework. And you can ask, who decided that I have that moral?
But you can ask the same question about ethics.
Less, because it's closer to the to law and order, if you want. You can bring some ethical concepts to law. Hard to say the same about morality, but okay. That is my problem. That's my first problem. The second is, I would ask Professor if he can develop a very interesting idea. I think a professor stands for that has a concept. Everything fundamental for the future happens between 0 and 24 years. This is the age when you can solve the problem of inequalities, many inequalities, territorial, social, etc. And if you act between 0 and 24. I think the concept the professor uses is something like social maternal, it's a social maternal approach. It's very, very interesting. And he has 3 models. It's one of the good things of Professor Collier. He is not just very good on theory, he gives you some practical approaches. And he says, the best model I know on the beginning of the education system is École maternelle from France. The best model I know in the secondary school is Finland. Decentralized teachers empowerment. And the third model, and if you consider university, okay, you have some of the best universities in UK, you have many others, but he admires, if I read well, he's very in favor of the Switzerland model of vocational training, and a much more labor training for system, much more connected between school and enterprises model. That's very good to have three paradigmas, one in France, one in Finland, one in Switzerland, to build a better evolution and better opportunities between the 0 and the 24 years old. So Paul, if you can develop, Professor, I think it would be good for our audience.
Thank you. Professor, I would like to ask you for a very short answer, because they're telling me we have very good questions from the audience. I'd like to share one of those.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant performance. And I'm so pleased you really read this book and understood it. Let me reassure you that Deng Xiaoping is one of my great heroes. And what Deng did was a model exactly of rapid learning. And it ran for 40 years. This is how he worked. He pulled together and said, right, this is the goal for the next 5 years. We don't know how to achieve it. And then he got the top 40 members of the Young Communist Party and said, each of you is going to be the governor of one of our 40 regions for the next 5 years. This is the goal I've set you. I don't know how to do it. Try something. Now, if you tell a bureaucracy to do that, you don't know how to do it, it freezes up. And he thought of that, so he said, if after the first 6 months you've not tried an experiment, you're called and thrown out of the group. We can learn from failure as well as success, but go and experiment. And then he monitored everything, and some things worked, some things didn't. He said to the people who were failing, go and look at the successes. It may be that their place is different, it may be that there's something to learn. You go and look, and if you think you can learn from it, bring it back. They ran that every 5 years for 40 years. It resulted in the fastest reduction in poverty we've ever had. It was magnificent. It's over. Xi is back to the model of highly centralized, overconfident leadership, I fear.
Professor Collier.
A brilliant 40 years. Putin has a very different business model, which is a model of plunder. I'll give you one quick fact, which is devastating of Putin. And this is the 7 years up to 2019, so before COVID hit. And Russian GDP grew by 6%. Not very fast, but at least it grew. The living standards of ordinary people fell by 7%. So that households got 7% less. What happened to the difference between the 6% growth and the 7% fall in household incomes? That 13% was taken by the oligarchs. They needed 2% of GDP every year as plunder. Now the economy stopped growing, the oligarchs are very greedy. Where's the 2% going to come from? That's Putin's massive problem. He doesn't know.
Professor Collier, thank you for your answer. I think it's time now for our first question to the audience, our first poll, and I believe we already have some results. I don't know if we can see them on the screen. Well, the question was, are you concerned about economic growth? And well, it was a very easy one just to warm up. It seems that like 75% of us are concerned with economic growth. And I would like to go back to one of the things that Dr. Paulo Portas, you mentioned about local communities and local...
The models.
Yeah, local versus global, because one of the things that Professor Collier told us is that one of the solution lies on empowering local communities. And we live in a world completely turned upside down. Nobody forecasted it, like you said, with, in Europe, new challenges like energy, like defense. I don't see how can we deal with these problems locally.
I don't think Professor Collier is standing for decentralization of energetic solutions. But I think one of the interesting ideas of Professor is decentralizing decision and to have a more balanced territory. Don't forget, one of his ideas is we are building strong inequalities between metropoles, big cities, and the others.
Yes.
Not only rural and urban, no. It's big metropoles like London and the others. And you just pay attention to the London vote and the England vote, and you feel the political consequences of that inequality. So, and by the way, he has an approach with a consequence. The consequence may be not popular. If our very good mayor of Lisbon was here, I think he would debate with Professor Collier. What he says, if my interpretation is right, that in a national territory, I mean national level, you have to have regional, balanced, I wouldn't say hubs, but very dynamic cities. Each region needs to attract and build the correct environment to a very dynamic center with universities, with innovation, with good local authorities, with communities, with more participation from families.
Engaging.
Okay? And he just says, oh, okay, there's no, London is not only the example. Pay attention to Edinburgh, if I remember. Pay attention to the Edinburgh. They are both above the national level. So his first idea is decentralize responsibilities, decentralize dynamics, business communities. Don't bring everybody to metropoles, and create incentives to a more balanced territory. And he says one of the incentives, I have some perplexities about, but if we can make a trade-off, one, you create a new tax and you erase an old one, that would be a good trade-off, I would say. But E stands for metropole. Metropoles are benefiting from a lot of national investments that brings their prosperity. So he says metropoles should share their prosperity with the rest of the territory. So E stands for some city taxes, okay? That's why Moedas should be here. And so I think it would be, but it's very interesting because in a global world, and it's right, I think, do you know one thing, Pedro? We are global and we are local also.
Yep.
And maybe, I personally think in the future, in the present, towns, cities, are a large part of our identity. Many times you choose towns and cities more than countries.
Yep.
Okay? So,
Yep.
local balance is global.
That's where we live. We are
And
connected.
I would let to Professor one question is it possible? Possible it is, but things are not exactly very balanced. Is it possible to have such a level of economic globalization and having almost none-level, a zero level of global governance? I mean, you have a global economics and you have global political problems. You don't have any kind of governance for global problems, both political and both economic. And you saw it in COVID, and you are witnessing the same problem in Ukraine. And if the next global crisis is climate, for instance, I'm not sure if it is, but it is a strong possibility, who is going to coordinate global policies? We have a Security Council, which is a photo from 1946. That world exists no more.
We haven't regenerated the
We don't
global
have an
institutions.
international crisis management system, at least. At least. Okay, Professor. But if you can develop a little bit France, Finland, and Switzerland, we would learn a lot.
I will, and indeed, what I was going to choose was the Switzerland model, because that is most pertinent for firms. Because vocational training, which is the Swiss model, is something where firms have to get involved. If firms don't drive vocational training, it fails. This is something, we got very good research on this. If the vocational training is organized and run only by the public sector, it completely fails. There's some very good studies on this. The essence of good vocational training is that you bring in very closely the public sector, the colleges, and the firms. The firms have to take responsibility for the vocational training, get involved day by day in the design of a course and its execution. That's what Switzerland does. I'm very impressed, as you say, by Switzerland, because at the level of quite ordinary cities, not Zurich, just minor cities, firms, as a matter of course, train the local youth. And what's really impressive to a British mind is that firms don't have to be rewarded with tax incentives for doing it. If they didn't do it, they would feel ashamed of themselves, and other business leaders would think they were letting their cities down. Because as you say, the city identity is really a very powerful thing. And one of the common purposes that most unites people is the idea that our children should not have to leave this region in order to succeed. And in Britain, the only place where you succeed is London and the southeast.
Yeah.
I grew up in what is now the poorest city in the whole of England, Sheffield. And both my parents left school when they were 12. In those days, it was possible to make that transition from that background to become a professor at Oxford, a professor at Harvard, Paris, and so on. It's not possible now. The opportunities are closed off. And this is the thing. I've done a lot of interviews in poor regions, not just in Britain, but around Europe. And that sense of we must provide a place where within the region which people identify, which offers children a promising future without having to leave it. Because if you have to leave your region, it tears the family apart.
Professor, we should move on because our time is running very, very fast. And I'm being told that we have a question from our audience. So I would like our voice to give us the question, please. We have a voice, I've been told.
This is the voice of the audience.
It works.
Can we really have more local decisions without having more taxes and bureaucracy?
Thank you. This is a very tough one. I don't know if you want to pick it up or shall we?
No, just I want to add one thing to the professor, but after it's very interesting to listen his answer.
Professor, do you want to answer this question? Because we have a fair amount of taxes, so it's a very interesting question for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk tax. So the poorer the region, the less sensible is it to pile new local taxes on. So here's the compromise, which I'm actually suggesting to my own government. And that is that some of the national taxes that are collected in poor regions a share of them should accrue not to the national government, but should be passed to the regional government. One big advantage of that is that once the regional government or the city government gets a share of local taxes, of the taxes that people pay nationally, once it gets a share, that local government has an incentive to grow its economy. And that means it has an incentive to talk with business and learn why it's hard in that region for businesses to grow.
So you're not talking about more taxes, but we're talking about the trade-off that Paul Portas was mentioning minutes ago. Is that realistic, Professor?
I think it's perfectly realistic. It's much more realistic than imposing new local taxes on very poor regions. That's not realistic. And if we don't give revenue incentives for poor regions to grow their own economies, then they will forever be just placing demands on central government. Local governments have to take responsibility for growing their economies, and for that, they have to talk with firms. And so there has to be a strong incentive for local governments to listen to the practical problems that firms face.
Professor, we have to move on.
So I don't have the time for a last...
You do have.
Professor,
a final remark, please.
You are a strong and sometimes desperate voice for rationality, which is the most difficult good to find in democracies in our days. Rationality, a rational decision, a rational process to decide, and rational solutions. Probably rational solutions are not so simple as a tweet. They are complex. They are complex, and complexity is part of our lives. So what I want, we are in a tech Congress, and I would ask you, how would you bring some doses of rationality to the political debate, having in consideration we are in a society highly dependent on social media?
Yes.
30 seconds, Professor Collier, please.
30 seconds for $1 billion.
For $1 million question. Anyway, we'll be back in June, so we can continue this conversation then.
So the 30-second answer to that is good leaders, first and foremost, have to be good communicators. Don't forget, Zelensky wasn't an intellectual genius, he was a comedian. The one thing he knew how to do was communicate. And through communicating, he educated people in a common purpose and then said, you work out how to do it. That, to my mind, is great leadership. It gives people a sense of purpose. And that touches people emotionally as well as rationally. So a good leader touches the emotional base, which inspires people to use their own brains.
A communicator-in-chief instead of a commander-in-chief, as you once told me.
Exactly.
Professor, thank you so much for being here with us today. Dr. Paul Porter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Before we leave the stage, I would like to announce who won the books you have autographed and sent us. These are the winners. Congratulations to them. And now I will stand up and move closer to our audience for 2 seconds. I will ask you if you can join me. Stand up for 5 seconds. It's a small exercise. Very, very, very quickly. And please praise yourselves. Congratulations, because you are a wonderful community. We have survived 2 years of pandemics, 1 war at the outdoors of Europe. Congratulations to yourselves. Thank you very much. See you next year.
Muito bem, podem continuar em pé, porque convido-os desde já a fazerem agora mais networking lá fora e numa breve pausa, e convido-os também a mergulharem num espaço que nós temos ali, um Demo Corner da Luso Space, numas tecnologias imersivas. São sensivelmente 20 minutos de pausa. Até já.